December 19th, 1944. Early morning. A thin frost clung to the steel doors of a U.S. Army prisoner transport train as it rolled west across the Mississippi River. Inside the dim, rattling boxcars, more than 100 captured German soldiers, members of the Wehrmacht's 352nd Infantry Division, huddled in heavy wool coats that still carried the smoke and dirt of Normandy. For days, they had been told nothing, only that they were being moved somewhere far away. A young Gefreiter named Karl Heinemann pressed his face to a slit in the wood, expecting to see the same things he'd witnessed across war-torn Europe: shattered buildings, twisted rail lines, smoke rising from cities that no longer had names. But what met his eyes instead made him pull back in disbelief. Outside, the world was untouched. The sun had just risen, spreading a pale gold across endless fields, barns, and long, straight highways. Cars, new cars, clean cars, moved in perfect lines. Families waited at railroad crossings. No rubble, no ruins, no craters. Just abundance. The train clattered forward, slowing as it approached a massive complex. At first, the prisoners thought it was a military depot. It wasn't. It was a factory, a sea of steel buildings larger than anything Karl had imagined. Roofs stretched beyond the horizon. Giant chimneys rose like towers. Conveyor belts ran from one warehouse to another. Everywhere, trucks rolled in and out, carrying crates and machinery. An American guard noticed their stunned expressions. "You boys ain't seen nothing yet," he muttered, almost casually. The Germans didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone. This place, this country, was not at war the way Germany was. It was building, expanding, feeding something enormous. As the train jerked forward again, passing rows of silent smokestacks and hundreds of parked vehicles waiting to be shipped, a Feldwebel named Otto Bremer whispered to the man beside him, "Das ist unmöglich. This can't be real." For years, German propaganda had insisted America was soft, chaotic, racially divided, crippled by crime and corruption. A nation with no discipline, no unity, no ability to sustain a long war. But here, right in front of them, was a scale of production Germany could never dream of matching. A land untouched by bombers, a workforce unbroken by shortages, an industrial machine that seemed to stretch forever. And this was only the beginning. The train whistle sounded again, long, deep, echoing across the winter plains, and the prisoners realized they were being taken deeper into a world they did not understand. A world's strength they had never truly believed in. And yet, they were about to see even more, something that would shake them far more than a giant factory. Something simple, something ordinary to Americans, but almost unimaginable to men who had survived on ration cards and empty promises. Food, abundant, effortless food, awaiting them at the camp. Something that would make several prisoners question everything they had been told about this country.
The train screeched as it slowed, metal wheels grinding against the rails. By the time it stopped, the morning frost had thawed into a soft mist rolling over the Kansas prairie. The door slid open with a harsh slam, and sunlight flooded the boxcars, So bright, the prisoners shielded their eyes with trembling hands. They expected shouting, rough handling, the familiar bark of guards treating them like enemies. But instead, the Americans simply said, "All right, fellas, out you go." Their voices calm, almost bored, as if they were unloading farm tools rather than prisoners of war. The Germans stepped down onto hard-packed earth. Some limped. Some squinted around. All of them froze. The camp looked nothing like a prison. The wooden barracks were freshly painted, windows intact, roofs straight. The place felt orderly, quiet, even peaceful. A tall water tower rose above it all, painted white and glinting in the sun. Everything seemed too clean, too steady, too normal for a world at war. Karl Heinemann stared at the distant fields that stretched out unbroken for miles. Not a single trench, not a single crater, just the soft winter wind brushing through golden grass. Then the smell hit them. Warm bread, coffee, something sweet. Was it fruit? Most hadn't smelled anything like it in months. Some hadn't smelled it in years. An American sergeant waved them forward. "Mess hall first. You look half frozen." Mess hall? Food? Now? A few Germans exchanged suspicious glances. Back home, even civilians stood in ration lines for hours. Soldiers on the front survived on thin soup poured from rusty pots. Bread was stale, meat was a rumor, and coffee was made from roasted barley because real beans had disappeared long ago. But as they stepped into the hall, silence fell over them. Long tables, steam rising from metal trays, white plates, stainless steel utensils, and food. So much food, the room felt unreal. Fresh eggs stacked in warm pans, thick slices of bread, butter, actual yellow butter, not the gray substitute used in Germany, stewed apples, mashed potatoes, beef stew thick with carrots. It looked like a feast. A soldier from Württemberg whispered, voice cracking, "Das ist ein Traum. This is a dream." Some wouldn't touch the plates at first, convinced it was a trick. Others sat down slowly, confused when American cooks simply nodded and moved along the line. And when the Germans finally tasted the food, a wave of silence swept over the room, heavy, almost emotional. For many, it was the first real meal they had eaten since before the Eastern Front, before Stalingrad, before Normandy, before the retreat that never seemed to end. One POW, Unteroffizier Emil Kruger, ate so fast he choked on his first spoonful, then laughed, embarrassed, wiping his eyes with the back of his sleeve. Another older man chewed his bread slowly, staring down at the crust as if it held some kind of secret. But what stunned them most wasn't the meal, it was what happened next. The American guard walked down the aisle and said, "You want seconds? Go ahead. There's plenty." Plenty. A word that barely existed in wartime Europe. In Germany, children searched dumpsters for potato peels. Women traded jewelry for a pound of flour. Soldiers received rations cut thinner every month. Even officers struggled to find meat. And here, in the enemy's camp, there was enough for seconds, enough for thirds, enough that the cooks joked about too much beef taking up storage. A quiet realization spread through the prisoners like a cold wind. If America could feed the men who had fought against it this well, how well was it feeding its own army? How much steel, fuel, wheat, and machinery could it produce? How many ships could it build? How many aircraft? How many tanks rolling off assembly lines the Germans had never even seen? Otto Bremer swallowed his last bite and looked around the room. "This," he whispered, "is why we will lose. Not the battlefield, not the strategy, not the generals, but this effortless abundance." It was the first time many of them understood the scale of the war, not as propaganda, not as rumor, but standing right in front of them on a simple wooden table. And yet, they were still not prepared for what they would see next. Something that would shake them even deeper than the food. Something not about America's wealth, but about its people, their attitude, their impossible kindness towards the very men they were fighting.
The prisoners stepped back outside after the meal, their stomachs warm for the first time in months. The cold winter air stung their faces, but it almost felt refreshing, like the world had become clearer somehow. A few wiped their mouths with the backs of their hands, still embarrassed at how quickly they'd eaten. Others just stood still, trying to process what they had witnessed. But the next shock came quietly. Not from machines, not from factories, not from American military power. It came from the people. As the guards guided the newly arrived Germans toward the barracks, the wooden fence bordering the camp caught everyone's attention. Just on the other side, lining a simple gravel path, stood a small group of civilians, men, women, a few children. They weren't shouting, they weren't scowling, they weren't even curious in a hostile way. They were watching, calmly. Some even smiled. Gefreiter Lucas Brenner blinked hard, confused. Back home, civilians had learned to fear anything foreign, anything unfamiliar. Here, the locals leaned on bicycles or stood with canvas grocery bags, observing the German POWs with the kind of relaxed interest you'd show farm animals or new neighbors. A little boy tugged at his mother's coat. "Mama, are those the soldiers from Europe?" His voice carried over the fence. His mother nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, they're prisoners of war." "Are they dangerous?" "No, they're just men far from home. Just men, not monsters, not propaganda posters. Just men." The German prisoners didn't know how to react. Then something happened that none of them expected. A middle-aged American man raised his hand in a small, polite wave. Not mocking, not triumphant, just a simple gesture of welcome, or perhaps acknowledgement. One of the older Germans, a sergeant with gray at his temples, instinctively straightened his posture and returned a hesitant nod. It felt absurd, like they had accidentally wandered into the wrong war. And then the farmers came. Later that afternoon, a group of local farmers arrived at the camp to speak with the American officers. The area was in desperate need of extra hands for the harvest, and the government allowed POWs to work on farms so long as they were treated humanely and paid modest wages. Many POWs had heard rumors about this system, rumors they dismissed as American propaganda. But then the gates opened, and the farmers walked in, shaking hands with the guards, casual and friendly. A tall farmer with a sunburned neck peered at the row of Germans standing at attention. He examined them the way you might examine horses at a market. Practical, not hateful. Finally, he pointed at a young POW, a mechanic named Werner Kurler. "I'll take that one," he said. "Looks like he knows how to use his hands." Werner flinched, expecting to be shoved forward. Instead, the guard turned to him and said gently,
"You okay working outside camp today?" Werner stared at the man, confused. "Do I have a choice?" The guard shrugged. "You can stay if you want, but farms treat you well. You get fresh food, long hours, good pay." Pay. The word struck the Germans like a hammer. They were being offered wages, money, freedom to walk fields instead of being locked behind bars. It felt unreal. As Werner climbed into the back of the farmer's truck, he looked at the guard again. "Why are you asking if I'm okay?" The American gave a small smile. "You're a prisoner, sure, but you're also a human being." A human being. Werner sat down slowly, his hands trembling. In the Reich, he had been taught Americans were brutes, criminals, mongrels. Here, he felt treated with more dignity than he had received from some of his own officers. Back near the barracks, another scene unfolded that would stay burned into many POWs' memories. A young American nurse, maybe 19, walked past the fence carrying a box of medical supplies. A German prisoner near the wire stared at her, stunned by the sight of merciful gestures. Germany had no nurses to spare for simple transport duties. Everyone was swallowed by the front or the ruins. The girl paused, noticing his bandaged hand. "Did that happen during the capture?" He nodded silently. "Hold on," she said, and disappeared into the small medical shed. When she returned, she handed a guard a clean bandage and some ointment. "Give this to him. It'll help with the swelling." The guard raised his eyebrow. "You sure? He's a POW." "So," she replied softly, "he's hurt, isn't he?" The POW lowered his head, overwhelmed. Kindness from a girl who had every reason to hate him. Kindness from an enemy he had been told was incapable of compassion. One of the prisoners whispered under his breath, "Wie sollen wir gegen Leute kämpfen, die so sind?" How can we fight against people who are like this? The question lingered in the cold air, and as night settled over the camp, as warm lights glowed from inside the barracks, and the sound of American swing music drifted faintly from a distant radio, another truth sank into the Germans' hearts. If this is how America treated the enemy, how immense must its strength truly be? But their greatest shock was still waiting for them. Something vast, something mechanical, something that would make even the most loyal Nazis reconsider everything they thought they knew. A sight they would remember for the rest of their lives.
The next morning, the prisoners were woken before sunrise. The winter air bit sharply at their faces as they were lined up outside the barracks, breath rising in pale clouds. The guards didn't bark orders or shove them forward. The process was steady, calm, almost routine. A few Germans exchanged uneasy glances. This quiet efficiency was unsettling in its own way. "Move out! Transport's here," one guard called. The prisoners expected trucks. Instead, they saw buses. Clean, polished military buses, heated, with padded seats. The kind of transport German soldiers only ever saw in propaganda posters. A few POWs stared as if they were hallucinating. Unteroffizier Bremer whispered, almost angrily, "Warum behandeln Sie uns so? Why do they treat us this way?" No one had an answer. The buses rumbled down the long road leading away from the camp, passing towns with bright storefronts, gasoline stations with glowing signs, and rows of homes dusted with winter frost.
It wasn't luxury, just normal American life. And that was the point. Normal here meant abundance. Normal here meant stability. Normal here meant power. After an hour, the buses turned towards something massive in the distance, something so large it made every man on board sit straighter. At first, it looked like a fog bank. Then it took shape. Rows of buildings, chimneys, steel cranes towering like skeletons of giants. A shipyard. A shipyard so enormous it seemed impossible. The buses slowed to a crawl as they passed a line of Liberty ships under construction, steel hulls rising out of the water like mountains being forged. Welding sparks leapt into the air. Rail tracks fed into warehouses. In the distance, more ships, completed ones, waited to be launched. The Germans pressed against the windows, stunned into absolute silence. One American guard stood in the aisle, arms crossed. "This here is the Kaiser Yard," he said to no one in particular. "Builds a ship every few days." The prisoners turned sharply, eyes widening. Every few days? They thought he was joking. But then they saw it. A giant billboard near the waterfront showing production statistics. Ships completed, tonnage launched, workers employed, tens of thousands of workers, a schedule that ran day and night. Karl Heinemann felt his stomach twist. Back home, they had spent months scraping metal from ruins just to repair a single tank. Here, ships rose endlessly, as if the land itself gave birth to steel. This wasn't just industry, it was a force of nature. Hermann Schultz, once a proud believer in Germany's unbreakable will, whispered, "Dagegen konnten wir nie gewinnen." We could never win against this. Behind him, another prisoner shook his head slowly, tears forming, not from pain, but from understanding. The buses continued forward until they reached a small observation area reserved for military visitors. The prisoners were made to step outside, where the freezing air hit them again, but none of them cared. Their eyes were fixed on the sight before them. A nearly completed Liberty ship was preparing for launch. Workers, men and women together, moved across the deck like ants. Cranes lifted engines the size of houses. Welders showered sparks down the ship's hull in blazing cascades. Then came the horn, a deep, resonant blast that shook the ground beneath their boots. The ship slid forward, slowly at first, then faster, cutting through the icy water with a thunderous splash. Workers cheered, flags waved. Another vessel, bigger than anything the Germans had expected, was already being assembled in the next slipway. Bremer murmured, "They build ships like we build hopes, quickly and with more strength than we ever imagined." But the shock wasn't just the speed, it was the mood. No panic, no desperation, no fear of bombing. Just organized, unstoppable momentum. A machine of democracy, a machine of resources, a machine of sheer, overwhelming scale. The Germans stood motionless, watching the glowing sparks, the steam, the cranes, the people. Watching a nation's full power without a single bomb falling on its soil. And in the quiet of that icy morning, every man came to the same heavy realization. The war they thought they understood was never truly winnable. And they knew this was only the first chapter of a story that would follow them for the rest of their lives.
Night settled slowly over the camp, draping the barracks in a soft blue darkness. After the overwhelming day of the shipyards, the Germans returned exhausted. Physically, yes, but more so emotionally. Their boots felt heavier, their coats colder, as if the weight of what they had witnessed had seeped into their bones. Dinner was quiet. Even the most talkative prisoners spoke little, pushing their trays on the long wooden tables while their minds replayed the sight of Liberty ships sliding into water like steel giants. Outside, the hum of distant American industry never stopped. Generators, trains, unseen machinery. It was a lullaby of power, steady and calm. A kind of power Germany no longer possessed. When lights out came, the barracks went dark, except for the soft glow of a single bulb near the guard station outside. Most men lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to quiet their thoughts. The cold crept through the wooden walls, but for many, it wasn't the cold keeping them awake. It was realization. Obergefreiter Emil Vogt rolled onto his side, listening to the faint rustle of blankets around him. Someone whispered a prayer. Another man coughed. Outside, the wind brushed against the thin window frames. Then, from a bed across the room, a soft voice spoke into the darkness. Habt ihr es gesehen? Did you see it? Silence at first. Then a quiet answer. Ja, ich werde es nie vergessen. Yes, I'll never forget it. The conversation grew, barely above a whisper, carried through the room like drifting smoke. They build a ship in days. Days, Tage, not months. They don't hide in bunkers. Their factories stand in the open. They don't ration food. Their workers are strong. They have everything we were told they lacked. They lied to us. That last line hung in the air, heavy and painful. Emil shifted on his mattress, staring up at the wooden beams. He remembered a speech he'd heard from a Nazi officer only months earlier, how America was decadent, lazy, weak, how its citizens lacked discipline, unity, sacrifice, how the war would be short and victory certain. Now, lying in an American barracks with a full stomach, warm blankets, and the memory of a shipyard larger than any German city block, Emil felt anger burning behind his ribs. Not anger at the Americans, anger at the men who had sent him across the ocean to fight an enemy they never truly understood. A storm rolled in near midnight, bringing soft rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Droplets tapped against the thin tin roof in a gentle, sleepy rhythm. One by one, the prisoners drifted into uneasy dreams. But not all. Feldwebel Johann Adler lay awake, hands folded behind his head, staring at the shadows crawling across the ceiling. He was older than the others, in his early 40s, his face carved by years of service. He had fought in France, in the Balkans, and most recently in North Africa before his capture. He had seen war from every angle, but never had he seen anything like the United States. He exhaled slowly. This country, he thought, it has no fear. Germany built under bombs. America built under open skies. Germany rationed bread. America fed prisoners better than Germany fed some civilians. Germany salvaged scrap metal from ruins. America buried scrap metal because there was too much of it. The rain intensified, pattering more urgently on the roof. In the corner bunk, a young soldier named Keller whispered, "Feldwebel, do you think we can still win?"
The question floated through the dim, wet air. Others shifted in their beds, not daring to answer, waiting for the older man's voice. Johann swallowed hard. He wanted to lie. He wanted to give the boy hope. He wanted to repeat the words that had been drilled into him for years, but he couldn't. 9, he whispered. No, not after today. Silence filled the room again, heavy, complete, suffocating. Outside, a train horn sounded in the distance, long, low, steady. It wasn't frightening. It was simply the sound of a country that could move mountains at will. A country that wouldn't stop. As the storm eased and the night deepened, one truth settled over the camp like a final, quiet verdict. This war would end. Germany would lose. And every man in that barracks knew it now. But the real shock, the true collapse of everything they had been taught, would not come from factories, ships, or abundance. It would come from something deeper, more human, and far more difficult for them to understand. What these men would witness next would change the way they saw America forever.
Dawn crept over the Oklahoma plains like a slow-moving curtain of pale gold, revealing the camp in soft, almost peaceful silence. Frost clung to the wooden barracks, and a thin ribbon of smoke rose from the kitchen chimney. Inside Barrack 12, Obergefreiter Hans Keller lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams while the camp loudspeaker crackled to life. At first it was only static, then a voice. Calm, American, reading the morning news bulletin. Hans had heard English broadcasts before, usually from scratchy, state-filtered radio stations in occupied France. But this was different. The voice listed production numbers, how many B-24s rolled out of Ford's Willow Run plant that month, how many Liberty ships had launched from the West Coast, how many tons of food America had shipped to its allies in a single week. Numbers that sounded impossible. Numbers no one in Germany had ever imagined could be real. Around Hans, the other POWs sat up slowly, quietly. No one spoke. They simply listened. 75,000 trucks delivered to Allied forces this quarter. 3 new aircraft carriers commissioned. Record corn harvest expected. Hans felt a coldness spread through his chest. Not fear exactly, but an understanding that came like a stone dropped into deep water. He remembered Berlin's radio propaganda insisting America was collapsing under war fatigue. He remembered the speeches claiming U.S. factories were empty shells, relying on inferior workers incapable of sustained production. But here, in this untouched country, the truth stood right in front of him. Across the room, Lieutenant Franz Haller whispered, barely louder than breath, "If this is what they produce in a week, what are we fighting for?" No one answered. Later, during work detail, the POWs were loaded onto trucks and driven past endless rows of wheat fields and oil derricks, turning lazily in the wind. A convoy of brand-new Studebaker trucks thundered down a nearby road, vehicles built so fast that the paint still gleamed like glass. The men watched silently as the convoy passed, stretching far into the horizon.
One of the guards noticed their wide eyes and chuckled. "He's just Tuesday's production," he said, not unkindly. And something inside the POWs broke, quietly, invisibly. For many, it was the first moment the war stopped feeling like a heroic struggle and started feeling like a doomed march against a machine too vast to comprehend. But that realization came with something else, something unexpected. Not fear, not anger. Respect. A respect they were never meant to feel. A respect their commanders had told them was impossible. And as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the fields, Hans Keller understood a truth he would carry for the rest of his life. Germany hadn't just been outfought. It had been outbuilt, outsupplied, and outlasted before the war even truly turned.
The winter of 1945 settled over the American heartland like a long, soft exhale. By then, rumors were spreading through every POW camp. Talk of Germany's collapse, of cities burned into ash, of roads filled with refugees. Inside Camp Gruber, the men listened in silence, their faces pale, their shoulders heavy with the realization they had first tasted months earlier. The war had moved beyond them, and soon they would be going home. One gray morning, the guards handed out small slips of paper stamped with orders for repatriation. Names echoed down the dusty parade ground. Keller, Hans; Haller, Franz; Meyer, Otto. Hans stood perfectly still as his name was read. For a moment he didn't move, as if hearing a sound from another world. Then he stepped forward, folded the paper gently, and slid it into his coat pocket. A strange mixture stirred in him: relief, fear, gratitude, and a quiet ache for the unknown that waited across the Atlantic. The next days passed in a blur of preparation. The POWs cleaned their barracks one last time, packed what little they owned, and took farewell photos with guards who weeks earlier they had feared. The Americans, for their part, shook hands, shared cigarettes, even offered advice about rebuilding their lives. On the final morning, the men were marched toward the train station outside the camp perimeter. Frost crackled beneath their boots. Overhead, the sky glowed faintly pink, the same color Hans had seen the day he first arrived, stunned by America's sheer immensity. But now, as he looked back at the camp, he felt something he could not have imagined months earlier. A sense of gratitude toward a country that had treated him not as a monster, but as a man. At the station, the POWs boarded the transport cars. Just before stepping inside, Hans paused and turned around. He stared at the endless plains, the distant silhouettes of factories, the rows of new farmhouses untouched by war. It felt unreal. A land not scarred by destruction, but overflowing with possibility. For a moment, he wondered what Germany might have become if war had never taken hold, if factories had made tractors instead of tanks, if young men had planted wheat instead of carrying rifles. The thought landed deep, heavy, painful. The train whistle shrieked. He took his seat. As the train pulled away, the POWs watched America slide past one last time, its broad fields, humming power lines, and miles of freight cars loaded with supplies that would help rebuild the very continents Germany had destroyed. Some men whispered to each other. Others stared out the window in silence.
Franz Haller leaned back against the wooden wall and murmured, "This is the real power of a nation. Not fear, not speeches. This." Hans closed his eyes. He could still hear the American morning broadcast, the endless list of production numbers, and the farmers waving as the trains rolled by, and the guards who shared coffee on cold nights. He suddenly understood something with painful clarity. His old world was gone, but a new one shaped by what he had seen here, might still be built. Weeks later, as the POW ship crossed the Atlantic back toward a shattered Europe, Hans stood on the deck at dusk. The ocean wind whipped against his coat. Behind him, the lights of New York faded into the distance, glowing like embers from a fire that never went out. Ahead lay darkness, uncertain, cold, but waiting. He breathed slowly, deeply. He was going home, but he was not the same man that had been captured in the Tunisian desert. He was returning with a truth carved into him by trains, factories, kindness, and quiet American mornings. Industrial might had won the war, but humanity had changed the defeated. The war had ended, yet its lessons were only beginning.